Opening the center, this pawn stake immediately contests key squares and prepares rapid development for the king's bishop and queen. Mirroring white's central pawn grab instantly stakes a claim to the same vital square, setting the stage for an immediate pawn duel. Developing a knight quickly to threaten the central pawn and prepare castling establishes immediate pressure and opens lines. Developing a knight to c6 naturally contests the center and prepares for rapid piece play. Unleashing a potent pin, white immediately questions black's knight, setting up potential tactical skirmishes and influencing the central pawn structure. Aggressively challenging the bishop's influence on the queen side, a6 boldly questions white's initial pressure and seeks to gain queenside space. Preserving the bishop's diagonal control maintains pressure on black's queenside pawn structure. Solidifying the center and preparing to develop the bishop, while indirectly challenging white's knight. Instantly challenging the center, white aims to unravel black's pawn structure and open lines for an attack. Developing the bishop to d7 allows black to connect their rooks, reinforcing the central pawn structure and preparing for potential counterplay on the king side. Retreating the bishop to b3 clears the e4 pawn, aiming to strike at the center and maintain diagonal influence, while also preparing for potential kingside advances by safeguarding the piece from the aggressive a6 pawn. Opening the central e-file now frees black's queen and bishop from their initial pawn blockade, preparing to contest the center more actively, though it does grant white a clear path to a central pawn majority if they can maintain it. Reclaiming the central pawn with the knight immediately contests black's pawn majority and opens the d-file, placing pressure on the e5 pawn and potentially preparing a kingside attack. Developing the knight to its natural outpost on f6 aims to challenge white's central pawn and prepare for castling, simultaneously increasing black's influence over the d5 square and potentially creating tactical possibilities if white's knight on d4 overextends. Sharpening the central pressure, nc3 supports the knight on d4 and prepares potential pawn advances or piece activity on the kingside, aiming to gain a positional edge while maintaining flexibility. Solidifying the knight's dominance on d4 and preparing for castling kingside, the bishop tucks away safely, avoiding any immediate skirmishes and maintaining a balanced development. A strategic retreat, this knight repositions to a more passive square, potentially paving the way for a pawn push on the kingside or facilitating piece redistribution. Observe how this subtle repositioning opens up lines for other pieces and influences the central pawn structure. Asserting pressure on the queen side, this knight aims to displace the active bishop and potentially infiltrate on the c4 square, disrupting white's control over the center and opening avenues for counterplay. Securing the monarch amidst the developing skirmish, castling now initiates a proactive phase, liberating the rooks and setting the stage for a more dynamic battle rather than passively reacting to black's knight's adventurous sortie towards the queen side. The king's fortress is now secured, bringing a breath of fresh air to the center of the board. Building a solid kingside pawn structure, f3 prepares to reinforce the e4 pawn and potentially launch a future kingside attack by supporting g4, though it does temporarily create a slight weakness on the e3 square. Recentering the rook along the open files offers a robust defensive posture, preparing to contest the e-file and bolster the central pawn chain should white attempt to advance. Initiating development to the active diagonal, this bishop seeks to control key squares and support potential pawn pushes, preparing to activate its powerful long-range presence. Black prepares to reroute the bishop, aiming to establish it on a more active diagonal, potentially influencing the kingside or central squares once the queenside pawns advance. Unleashing the queen to d2 initiates a coordinated surge, aiming to both solidify the central pawn structure and prepare for a potential queenside expansion. Unlocking the queenside pawns opens up avenues for development, a sharp tactical reshuffle that forces white to reconsider their piece's positioning and the pawn structure's integrity. Opening the file provides immediate open lines for your rook, aiming to pressure black's queenside and potentially create breakthroughs. Steering the bishop to e6 subtly aims to exchange it for white's well-placed knight, a positional concession black is willing to make to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially open lines for their own pieces. Knight pivoting to f4 aims to exert pressure on the queen side and potentially create tactical skirmishes around black's king, eyeing squares like d5 or g6 if opportunity arises, while simultaneously bolstering white's central control and preparing for potential pawn advancements on the king side. A strategic reassessment unfolds as the knight ventures to d7, seeking to liberate its comrade on c6 from the pressure of white's central pawn structure, and potentially eyeing a quicker path to the queen side. This repositioning signals a desire to consolidate material and perhaps prepare for a more active role in the d-file or even a sortie to b6. The knight's previous outpost on a5, while initially disruptive, has perhaps become somewhat static, and this transition aims to inject fresh dynamism into black's setup, building towards a more cohesive defensive and offensive framework. Anchoring the rook to the d-file solidifies white's central presence, preparing for potential pawn pushes or further piece development that leverages the open file. Solidifying the pawn chain and preparing to challenge the open d-file now. Shifting the queen to the f-file, white aims to connect rooks and potentially prepare a kingside advance or pressure along the newly opened central files, subtly repositioning for an assault on black's slightly cramped position. Embracing the queenside pressure, this maneuver immediately questions white's central pawn structure and aims to exploit the open, a file potentially forcing concessions, or preparing a disruptive exchange. Initiating a subtle repositioning of the queen, 18. QG3 aims to redeploy this crucial piece to a more active square, potentially supporting an advance on the king side or exerting pressure on the e6 bishop. The queen's journey from d2 to g3, a seemingly minor shift, often heralds a change in white's attacking strategy, seeking to create new lines of assault or to find a better vantage point from which to observe and influence the evolving battle. This maneuver might be a prelude to a kingside pawn storm or an attempt to improve the queen's defensive capabilities should black decide to launch an offensive. Consider the possible targets now available and the defensive adjustments this requires. A bold repositioning, this knight abandons its central influence to seek a more dynamic outpost on e5, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create attacking chances on the king side. A curious retreat, relocating the knight from the active central square to a more passive role on the second rank, perhaps anticipating a future advance of the kingside pawns, or seeking to avoid complications that might arise if the knight were to be challenged on e2. Reclaiming that bishop to its prior post offers a subtle but significant improvement, aiming to consolidate piece harmony and prepare for future pawn pushes on the queen side, while simultaneously preventing white's knight from finding an optimal square on f5. Targeting the centralized knight immediately disrupts black's developing harmony, forcing a difficult decision for its defender. Initiating a queenside expansion to challenge white's central structure, black signals an intention to seize the initiative on that flank. This pawn thrust aims to create a dynamic imbalance, forcing white to reevaluate their defensive setup and potentially commit more resources to the queenside. It's a provocative maneuver, seeking to unravel white's potentially solid pawn chain by forcing concessions or creating weaknesses. The long-term implications of this pawn advance will heavily influence the ensuing maneuvering, potentially opening lines for black's rooks or creating outposts for future piece activity. Securing the kingside from potential pawn thrusts like g5 or h5, this move subtly reinforces white's pawn structure, creating a more robust defensive perimeter around the monarch and preparing for a potential central pawn break in the future by not allowing immediate pawn advances. A bold pawn thrust, black seeks to immediately disrupt white's queenside structure and create dynamic imbalances. White retreats the knight to a more passive square, perhaps seeking to reroute it to c3 to support a potential d5 pawn push or to contest the a4 d1 diagonal if black pushes c5. This maneuver acknowledges the current tactical complexity, prioritizing piece coordination over immediate aggression, while subtly preparing to shore up the queenside and potentially target black's advanced pawns. Black boldly ignites a central pawn storm, seeking to unravel white's queenside pawn structure and create dynamic play, though it risks weakening the light squares around their own king. The knight hops back, seemingly retreating, but this repositioning is designed to eye the critical d4 square and potentially support a kingside expansion. White aims to unblock the c3 knight and prepare for a more dynamic pawn push, possibly c4, to challenge black's central pawn chain and gain a foothold on the queenside. Observe how this seemingly passive maneuver sets the stage for future tactical skirmishes by reorienting white's defensive and offensive capabilities. A sudden thrust, black's queen boldly infiltrates the queenside, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially exploit the weakened b-file now that the knight has retreated to b1. This aggressive maneuver challenges white's spatial advantage and forces a crucial decision regarding defense and counterplay. Unleashing a pawn storm on the queenside, white aims to shatter black's positional shell and generate attacking prospects by creating open lines, a bold gambit that could expose the king if black can effectively parry the assault and counterpunch. A bold foray into white's territory, NC6* aims to exploit the newly opened c-file and pressure the central pawn structure, potentially disrupting white's coordinated pieces and creating tactical opportunities around the king. Suddenly, the seemingly quiet position explodes with a daring pawn grab, sacrificing material for immediate tactical complications and a desperate attempt to disrupt black's well-placed pieces. A bold gambit for material is presented here. The question is whether the unleashed initiative and the king's sudden exposed state justify the exchange. Recapturing the pawn with the knight ignites a strategic battle for central control, aiming to disrupt black's newly established pawn chain and potentially open lines towards the king. A bold gambit to break the blockade. By capturing the pawn, black is aiming to shatter white's pawn structure and open lines for counterplay, even at the cost of material. This creates significant tactical complications and demands precise calculation from both sides. The immediate question is whether the open b-file and potential central breaks justify the sacrificed material and the exposed nature of black's king. Seizing the open file now after the knight's repositioning directly challenges black's weakened queenside pawn structure and potentially creates a dangerous outpost for the knight, while the other knight is poised to join the attack or solidify the center. Unleashing the queen into such a chaotic arena after a pawn sacrifice feels like a desperate gamble, hoping to overwhelm white's slightly uncoordinated pieces before they can consolidate their advantage. A daring, albeit potentially reckless, maneuver. White recaptures the pawn, aiming to simplify the position and reduce black's attacking potential. The immediate exchange on e4 clears the way for white's pieces and avoids any further immediate threats from black's centralized knight. This decision signals a desire to contest the central pawn structure and potentially enter an endgame where white might feel more comfortable given the slight imbalance in piece activity. However, white must remain vigilant against black's queen, which has found an active outpost on a2. The queen's sudden foray into the second rank rips open a gaping void around white's monarch, creating immediate tactical complications and forcing white to defend with extreme vigilance. Sacrificing the knight creates a forcing sequence, aiming to dismantle black's defenses by exposing their king. The king abandons the relative safety of its pawn shield, venturing into an exposed central area where the enemy knights and bishop actively prowl, a decision that sacrifices immediate defensive integrity for a potential regrouping that seems fraught with danger given white's active pieces and open lines. The knight's repositioning opens the d-file, creating a long-term battleground and forcing black to defend against potential pressure building on the queen's side. Releasing the pinned knight offers a desperate bid for activity, hoping to create mating threats against the exposed white king. Initiating a daring counterthrust towards black's exposed monarch, this maneuver aims to pry open lines and exploit the current disarray in the pawn structure. A desperate attempt to breathe life into the seemingly lost position by offering the rook for a pawn and hoping to create complications on the c-file. Reclaiming the d7 pawn immediately after its capture is a crucial attempt to stabilize white's structure and negate black's initiative, shifting the focus from the immediate material deficit back to positional development. Liberating the knight from its restricted position allows black to eye the kingside and potentially break the pawn chain. Opening the f-file now creates immediate pressure on black's vulnerable king and offers a path for white's rook to become active. Unlocking the c-file with this pawn thrust creates a dynamic, unbalanced position, forcing white to confront a potential invasion and the weakness on their queenside. The doubled pawns on the c-file create a permanent structural weakness for white, offering black a clear target for future pressure, while simultaneously opening the b-file for potential infiltration. Black retrieves a pawn, but it's a desperate attempt to counter white's overwhelming material and positional advantage. The queen's foray is risky, exposing it to further threats and neglecting the king's safety as white consolidates their central control and prepares to exploit the open files. Bringing the king to a safer square, preparing to defend against potential threats down the now open g-file while potentially freeing up the h-pawn for a future advance. A daring push for queenside space, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create new avenues for the queen and rooks. Repositioning the rook to the 7th rank exerts immediate pressure on black's pawns and discourages any further queenside expansion. Black's pawn advance aims to seize more space on the queenside, potentially unbalancing white's position by creating a passed pawn threat or forcing a concession along the a-file. This territorial ambition, however, risks overextending and creating weaknesses that white might exploit later. Unleashing the rook onto the 7th rank, white aims to exploit the exposed black king and the weakened diagonal leading to it, aiming for a quick checkmate or significant material gain by creating unstoppable threats. Shifting the bishop to the flank aims to pressure white's central pawns and potentially create opportunities for counterplay along the now open queenside diagonals, rather than passively defending the king. Activating that rook on the d-file now initiates a fascinating strategic duel, aiming to exploit the precariousness of black's pawns and potentially create a passed pawn while simultaneously challenging the enemy queen's control of the file. Embracing the open diagonal, black seeks to ignite activity on the queenside and pry open the c-file for potential counterplay. The queen reclaims an active post on g4, eyeing the potentially vulnerable dark squares around black's king. Probing the newly opened diagonal, ba3 seeks to activate the bishop and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure on the queenside, forcing a reaction from the knight or king. Initiating a bold material acquisition amidst black's pawn storm offers a dynamic shift, aiming to leverage white's activity to neutralize the queenside pressure and regain initiative. The rook's immediate retreat from the discovered attack allows black to consolidate and potentially prepare a counterplay on the queenside, exploiting the exposed white king. Unleashing the queen to potentially dominate the weakened queenside pawn structure, while simultaneously preparing to support the rook's advance. The bishop retreats, clearing the 3rd rank for potential rook activity on the queenside, but also conceding the b4 square which white might eye for a knight. Securing the open king file with the rook immediately pressures black's weakened position.